If you're a woman over 50 and you're in a relationship that doesn't make you happy, but you can't seem to leave, if you stay even though you know deep down something is fundamentally wrong, if you find yourself making excuses for why you're still there when everyone around you can see you're miserable, I need you to hear this. You might not be staying because you love this person. You might be staying because you're terrified of what happens if you leave. And there's a profound difference between a relationship held together by love and a relationship held together by fear. One nourishes you. The other slowly destroys you while you convince yourself you're doing the right thing by staying. Fear is a powerful adhesive. It keeps people glued to situations that are killing them. And the fear becomes so familiar, so constant, that you stop recognizing it as fear. You think it's love. You think it's commitment. You think it's loyalty. You think it's wisdom. You think it's being realistic. But underneath all those rationalizations, it's fear. Fear of being alone. Fear of financial instability. Fear of what people will think. Fear of starting over. Fear of admitting you wasted years. Fear of the unknown. And that fear keeps you frozen in a relationship that stopped serving you years ago, maybe decades ago. Psychologist Walter Riso, who has spent his career studying relationships and the psychology of dependency, teaches something that might be hard to hear. He says that many women, especially women over 50, are not in relationships. They're in prisons. Prisons they've built themselves out of fear. And they've decorated the prison so well, rationalized it so thoroughly, that they can almost convince themselves it's not a prison at all. But a decorated prison is still a prison. And no amount of rationalization changes the fact that you're not free. You're trapped. Not by your partner, though they may be part of the problem, but by your own fear. And here's what makes this particularly insidious for women over 50. You've invested decades in this relationship. 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. And the thought of leaving after all that time feels like admitting those decades were wasted, like throwing away half your life. So you stay. Not because the relationship is good, but because leaving would require admitting it was bad for a very long time. And that admission feels unbearable. So you stay in a bad situation to avoid confronting how long you've been in a bad situation. The fear of wasted time becomes the reason you waste more time. Today, I'm going to walk you through 7 specific signs that you're staying in a relationship out of fear, not love. These are not vague intuitions. These are concrete patterns that psychologists like Walter Riso have identified as hallmarks of fear-based relationships. And as I go through each sign, I need you to be honest with yourself. Brutally honest. Because denial is part of how fear keeps you trapped. You tell yourself stories, you make excuses, you minimize, you rationalize, and all of that denial keeps you from seeing the truth. That you're not staying because you love this person. You're staying because you're afraid of the alternative. For each of the 7 signs, I'll explain what it is, why it's fear and not love, what it's costing you, and what courage looks like in that situation. This is not about me telling you to leave your relationship. That's your decision. This is about helping you see clearly what's actually keeping you there. Because you can't make a real choice if you don't understand your real motivations. And if fear is your motivation, you deserve to know that. So you can decide whether that fear is justified or whether it's just a story you've been telling yourself for so long you've started to believe it. But before we go deeper, I need you to do something. If you're a woman over 50 who suspects you might be staying in a relationship out of fear, if you're not sure whether what you feel is love or just terror of the alternative, if you're ready to see your relationship clearly, even if that clarity is painful, subscribe to this channel right now. This is Enough and Whole. This is your space for truth, even when truth is hard. We don't do comfortable lies here. We do uncomfortable truths that set you free. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's walk through this together. Now let's begin. Let's look at the 7 signs, and let's see which ones you recognize in your own life. The first sign you're staying out of fear, not love, is this. When you imagine leaving, the thing that terrifies you most is not losing this specific person. It's being alone. You don't think about missing him. You think about an empty house, an empty bed, eating dinner by yourself, going to events alone, growing old alone, dying alone. The fear is not about losing the relationship you have. The fear is about not having any relationship at all. And that distinction matters, because if you're staying to avoid aloneness, not to preserve connection with this specific person, you're not staying for love. You're staying for company. And company is not love. Walter Riso teaches that fear of loneliness is one of the most powerful forces keeping women in dead relationships. Because loneliness feels like death. Especially for women over 50. You've been taught your whole life that a woman alone is a tragedy, a failure, something to be pitied. So the thought of being that woman, the alone woman, the single woman, the divorced woman, the woman without a partner, it feels unbearable. Worse than being unhappy, worse than being disrespected, worse than being in a relationship where you feel invisible. Because at least you're not alone. But here's what Walter Riso wants you to understand. Being physically alone is not the same as being lonely. And being in a relationship is not the same as being connected. You can be desperately lonely in a relationship. Many women are. Lying next to someone every night and feeling completely alone because there's no real intimacy, no real connection, no real seeing of each other. That loneliness, the loneliness of being unseen while being physically present, is often worse than the loneliness of actual solitude. Because at least in solitude, you're not pretending, you're not performing connection that doesn't exist, you're just alone. And aloneness, when you stop being terrified of it, can actually be peaceful. Why is this fear and not love? Because love is about wanting to be with a specific person because of who they are. Fear is about needing to be with anyone because you can't stand being alone. Love says, I want you. Fear says, I need someone, anyone, and this person is here, so I'll stay. Even if it's bad, even if I'm unhappy, because the alternative is no one, and no one feels like death. What is this costing you? Everything. It's costing you the possibility of a relationship where you're actually happy. Because as long as you stay in this one out of fear, you can't find that one. It's costing you self-respect because you're sacrificing your well-being to avoid being alone. And it's costing you the opportunity to discover that being alone might not be the tragedy you think it is. That you might actually be okay, maybe even happy, by yourself. What does courage look like? Courage looks like being willing to be alone rather than staying in something that makes you miserable. Courage looks like testing the fear. What if I was alone? What would actually happen? And realizing that the catastrophe you're imagining might not be reality. Courage looks like choosing your own company over bad company. Because being alone is not the worst thing that can happen to you. Losing yourself in a relationship that requires you to disappear, that's worse. Let me tell you about Patricia. She's 61. She'd been in a loveless marriage for 30 years. Her husband was emotionally distant, rarely spoke to her, showed no affection. But Patricia stayed. Why? Because the thought of being alone terrified her. She'd imagine herself eating dinner alone every night, watching TV alone, having no one to talk to, and it felt unbearable. At 61, her therapist asked her, "Are you less alone now, married, than you would be if you left?" Patricia started to say yes, then stopped, because she realized, I'm already alone. I eat dinner alone even though he's at the table. I watch TV alone even though he's in the room. I have no one to talk to even though he's in the house. I'm already living the thing I'm afraid of. I'm just doing it with someone else physically present. That realization changed everything. She wasn't avoiding loneliness by staying. She was living it. The only difference was she also had someone there to remind her every day that she was alone even when she wasn't. So Patricia left. And you know what she discovered? Being actually alone was less lonely than being married and alone. Because at least when she was alone, she wasn't constantly disappointed by someone's presence that felt like absence. Patricia told me 2 years later, I stayed for 30 years because I was afraid of being alone. But I was alone the whole time. I just didn't want to admit it. That's the first sign. You're more afraid of being alone than unhappy together. If that's you, you're staying out of fear. The second sign you're staying out of fear, not love, is the sunk cost fallacy. You stay because you've already invested so much time, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, and leaving now would mean admitting all that time was wasted. So you stay, not because the relationship is good, not because you're happy, not because you want to be there, but because you've already been there so long that leaving feels like throwing away half your life, and that feels unbearable. So you keep investing in something that's not working, because you've already invested so much. This is one of the most insidious forms of fear, because it masquerades as wisdom. You tell yourself you're being mature, realistic, committed. You tell yourself that relationships require work, and staying is the work. But Walter Riso teaches that there's a difference between working on a relationship that has potential and staying in a relationship that's fundamentally broken just because you've been there a long time. The first is wisdom. The second is fear disguised as wisdom. Here's the brutal truth about sunk costs. The time is already gone. You can't get it back whether you stay or leave. Staying doesn't make the past worth it. It just means you're adding more time to time that was already wasted. You're throwing good years after bad years, and the longer you stay, the more time you waste, the harder it becomes to leave because now you've invested even more. It's a trap, a fear trap that keeps you imprisoned in something that stopped working years ago. Why is this fear and not love? Because love is about the present and the future. Am I happy now? Do I want this person in my future? Fear is about the past. I've already spent so much time here. I can't leave now. It would mean all that time was for nothing. Love looks forward, fear looks backward, and looking backward while trying to live forward is how you crash. What is this costing you? It's costing you the rest of your life. Every day you stay in a relationship just because you've already been there a long time is a day you could have spent in a relationship that actually makes you happy, or alone and at peace, or building a different life. The sunk cost fallacy doesn't preserve your investment. It increases your loss, because now you're losing today and tomorrow to protect yesterday, and yesterday is already gone. What does courage look like? Courage looks like being willing to admit that time was wasted, that you stayed too long in something that wasn't working, and that admitting that doesn't make you a failure. It makes you human. We all make mistakes. We all stay in things longer than we should. And the courageous thing is not to stay forever to avoid admitting the mistake. The courageous thing is to acknowledge the mistake and stop making it. Let me tell you about Helen. She's 58. She'd been married for 35 years. The marriage had been bad for at least 20 of those years. No intimacy, no connection, constant tension. But Helen stayed. Why? Because 35 years felt like too much to walk away from. She'd tell herself, I've invested my entire adult life in this marriage. I can't leave now. It would mean 35 years were wasted. Her daughter finally asked her, Mom, if you'd only been married 5 years, would you stay? Helen said no immediately, then realized what that meant. She wasn't staying because the marriage was good. She was staying because it had been long. And length is not quality. 35 years of misery is not better than 5 years of misery. It's just longer misery. So Helen asked herself a different question. Do I want to spend the next 20 years like this? Because that's what staying means, not preserving the past 35 years, but committing to 20 more years of the same. And when she framed it that way, the answer was clear. No, she did not want 20 more years of this. So she left. At 58, Helen told me, I stayed for 20 years too long because I was afraid of wasting the first 15 years. But staying didn't make the first 15 years matter. It just wasted 20 more. That's the second sign. You stay because of time already invested. If that's you, you're staying out of fear. The third sign you're staying out of fear, not love, is that you're more concerned about what other people will think than how you actually feel. You stay because leaving would mean explaining to family, to friends, to your community why you're ending a long marriage. You stay because you're afraid of being judged, being gossiped about, being seen as someone who gave up, someone who couldn't make it work, someone who failed. And that judgment feels worse than staying in a relationship that's killing you. So you stay, not for you, for them, for their opinion, for their comfort, for their approval. Walter Riso teaches that women over 50 are particularly vulnerable to this fear because you grew up in a generation where divorce was stigmatized, where staying in marriage, no matter how bad, was seen as virtue, where leaving was seen as weakness or selfishness. So you internalized the message that good women stay, that ending a marriage means you failed, and that failure, that judgment, feels unbearable. So you perform happiness for an audience while dying inside. Because their approval feels more important than your actual life. But here's what you need to understand. The people whose opinions you're protecting, they're not living your life. They're not in your marriage. They're not lying next to someone who treats them with contempt. They're not living in the daily pain you're living in. They're just watching from the outside. And their judgment is based on their own fears, their own values, their own projections. It has nothing to do with what's actually right for you. Why is this fear and not love? Because love is internal. It's between you and your partner. It's about how you feel, how you're treated, whether the relationship nourishes you. But fear of judgment is external. It's about how things look, what other people think, whether you're meeting their expectations. And external approval cannot sustain internal misery. You can have everyone's approval and still be dying inside. And eventually, you have to choose their approval or your peace. You can't have both. What is this costing you? It's costing you your authenticity. You're performing a version of your life that looks acceptable while your real life is unbearable. It's costing you connection because you can't be honest with anyone about what's really happening. You have to pretend everything is fine to maintain the appearance. And it's costing you your one precious life. You get one life. And you're spending it being miserable to avoid other people's judgment. People who, if you're honest, don't actually matter that much. What does courage look like? Courage looks like being willing to be judged, to let people talk, to accept that some people will think you failed, and choosing your peace over their opinions anyway. Courage looks like recognizing that the people who judge you for leaving an unhappy marriage are people whose opinions don't deserve power over your life. And courage looks like living for yourself instead of performing for an audience. Let me tell you about Carol. She's 63. She'd been unhappy in her marriage for decades, but she stayed because she was terrified of what her family would think. Her parents had been married 50 years. Her siblings were all still married. Divorce was not something her family did, and the thought of being the first one to divorce, of facing their judgment, their disappointment, their gossip, it felt impossible. At 63, Carol's husband had an affair, and suddenly, leaving became easier. Not because the affair hurt more than the decades of mistreatment, but because now she had a socially acceptable reason to leave. Now people wouldn't judge her for leaving. They'd judge him for cheating. And Carol realized, I've been waiting for a reason that other people would accept. I've been living my life according to what they would approve of. And that's insane. So Carol left. And yes, some family members judged. Some friends gossiped, but others supported her. And the ones who judged? Carol realized they weren't living her life. They were just commenting on it from a safe distance. And their comments didn't deserve to control her choices. Carol told me, I wasted years being miserable to avoid judgment. But the judgment came anyway when I finally left. So I could have left years earlier and had the same judgment, but also had years of peace. That's the third sign. You're terrified of what people will think. If that's you, you're staying out of fear. The fourth sign you're staying out of fear, not love, is that you believe you're too old to start over. You think, I'm 55, 60, 65. Who's going to want me now? I can't start dating again at this age. I can't build a new life. It's too late. So you stay, not because the relationship is good, but because you believe the alternative, being single at your age, is worse. Because you've internalized the message that women over 50 don't get second chances, don't get fresh starts, should just accept whatever they have because nothing better is coming. This fear is particularly powerful because it's reinforced by culture. Everywhere you look, the message is that older women are undesirable, that your value expired, that youth is what matters and you don't have it anymore. So the thought of being single at 50, 60, 70, trying to date, trying to start fresh, it feels humiliating, impossible, like trying to play a game you've already lost by virtue of aging. So you stay with someone who doesn't value you because you believe no one else will either. But Walter Riso teaches that this belief is based on a lie. The lie that your value is your youth, that without youth, you have nothing to offer. But that lie erases everything you've gained. The wisdom, the self-knowledge, the depth, the experience, the lack of neediness, the groundedness. These things make you more valuable in relationship, not less. But you've been taught to discount them, to focus only on what you've lost, smooth skin and firm body, and ignore what you've gained, self-respect and clarity about what you want. Why is this fear and not love? Because love is about wanting to be with this specific person because of who they are and how they treat you. Fear is about settling for this person because you believe they're the only option available to you. Love is a choice. Fear is resignation. Love says, I choose you. Fear says, I'm stuck with you because I believe I can't do better. And settling is not love. It's just fear wearing love's mask. What is this costing you? It's costing you the possibility of something better. Maybe that's another relationship with someone who actually values you. Maybe that's being happily single and discovering you prefer it. Maybe that's rebuilding a life on your terms. You'll never know because you're too afraid to try. And it's costing you the rest of your life. You might live another 20, 30, 40 years. And you're planning to spend all of them in something that doesn't make you happy because you believe you're too old for anything else. What does courage look like? Courage looks like rejecting the lie that you're too old to start over. Courage looks like recognizing that being single at 50, 60, 70 is not a tragedy. It's just a status. And your value doesn't depend on having a partner. Courage looks like being willing to be alone rather than accepting treatment you don't deserve just because you think it's the best you can get. Let me tell you about Diane. She's 67. She stayed in a miserable marriage until 65 because she thought, I'm in my 60s. I can't start over now. No one wants a woman my age. I should just accept what I have. So she stayed. Until her husband's contempt became so unbearable she couldn't take another day. And at 65 she left. And she was terrified. Thought she'd be alone forever. Thought no one would want her. But she discovered something unexpected. There were men her age, widowed or divorced, who were looking for exactly what she had: maturity, depth, self-knowledge, lack of drama, and within a year, she met someone. A 68-year-old widower who treated her like she was precious, who valued her wisdom, who enjoyed her company, who made her laugh. But more importantly, Diane discovered that even before she met him, being alone at 65 was better than being married and miserable at 64. Because alone, she was at peace. She could do what she wanted, be who she was. And that freedom was worth more than having someone there who made her feel small. Diane told me, I stayed for decades because I thought I was too old to start over. But I wasn't too old. I was just too scared. And fear kept me in something terrible when something good was possible. That's the fourth sign. You can't imagine starting over. If that's you, you're staying out of fear. The fifth sign you're staying out of fear, not love, is financial terror. You stay because leaving would mean financial insecurity. Maybe you haven't worked in decades. Maybe you don't have your own income. Maybe everything is in his name. Maybe you don't know how you'd support yourself. Maybe you're afraid of being poor. So you stay, not because you love him, not because the relationship works, but because the financial alternative feels impossible. And that financial fear keeps you trapped in a relationship that's emotionally bankrupt, even though it's financially stable. This fear is particularly powerful for women over 50 because many of you made choices decades ago that put you in this position. You stayed home to raise children. You supported his career instead of building your own. You let him handle all the finances. And those choices made sense at the time. But now, they've created a trap, because leaving would mean starting from zero financially, at an age when starting over feels impossible. So you stay. And trade your emotional well-being for financial security, and tell yourself that's the practical, mature choice. But Walter Riso teaches that trading your soul for security is not wisdom, it's imprisonment. Because what you're really doing is accepting payment to stay in a relationship that hurts you. You're not a partner, you're an employee, and your payment is financial stability. But the cost of that payment is your peace, your dignity, your self-respect, your happiness. And at some point, you have to ask yourself, is the payment worth the cost? Is financial security worth emotional destruction? Why is this fear and not love? Because love doesn't require payment. Love is freely given, but you're not freely staying. You're staying because you believe you can't afford to leave. That's not a relationship. That's a transaction. And transactions are based on need, not love. You need the financial security, so you stay. But need is not love. Need is fear. Fear that without him, you'll be destitute. And that fear controls you. What is this costing you? It's costing you your autonomy. You're not free. You're dependent. And dependency breeds resentment. You resent him for having the power. He resents you for needing him. And the relationship becomes a power dynamic instead of a partnership. It's costing you self-respect because you know you're staying for money, not love. And it's costing you the chance to discover that you might be able to survive financially on your own. You might not be as helpless as you think. What does courage look like? Courage looks like getting honest about your financial reality, not your fear-based assumptions, your actual reality. How much would you need? What resources do you have? What could you earn? What support exists? Talk to a financial advisor, a lawyer, someone who can give you real numbers instead of fears. And then courage looks like being willing to have less money if it means having more peace. Because peace is worth more than comfort, and freedom is worth more than security. Let me tell you about Sharon. She's 64. She'd been in a loveless marriage for 30 years. Her husband was controlling, dismissive, made her feel worthless. But Sharon stayed because she'd never worked. Everything was in his name. And she was terrified of being poor. She'd imagine herself homeless, eating cat food, unable to afford anything, and that terror kept her frozen. At 64, Sharon finally went to see a lawyer, just to get information. And the lawyer told her something she didn't know. She was entitled to half of everything: the house, the retirement accounts, everything they'd built together. And with her half plus spousal support, she'd be fine. Not rich, but fine. She could afford a modest apartment, could live simply but comfortably. The catastrophe she'd been imagining wasn't reality. So Sharon left. And yes, her lifestyle changed. Smaller home, tighter budget. But she was at peace. For the first time in 30 years, she was at peace. And she realized, I traded 30 years of peace for financial comfort. And it wasn't worth it. I should have left decades ago and lived in a smaller place. Because peace in a small apartment is better than misery in a big house. Sharon told me, I stayed for 30 years because I was afraid of being poor. But I was already poor. Emotionally poor, spiritually poor. I had money, but I had nothing else. That's the fifth sign. You're financially dependent and terrified. If that's you, you're staying out of fear. The sixth sign you're staying out of fear, not love, is that leaving would feel like admitting your entire life was a mistake. You gave up your 20s, 30s, 40s, maybe your 50s to this relationship. You sacrificed career opportunities, moved for his job, put his dreams first, raised his children, built his life. And if you leave now, all of that feels like it was for nothing. Like you wasted your entire life on someone who didn't deserve it. And that admission feels unbearable. So you stay. Not because the relationship is good, but because leaving would require acknowledging how much you gave to something that wasn't worth it. This is a particularly painful form of fear because it's tied to identity. You've built your identity around this relationship. You're his wife, the mother of his children, the woman who supported his success. And if the relationship ends, who are you? What was the point of all those years? What do you have to show for your life? And those questions feel so painful that you avoid them by staying, by continuing to invest in something that's not working, so you don't have to face how much you've already invested in something that never worked. Walter Riso teaches that this is the sunk cost fallacy applied to identity. You're not just afraid of wasting time. You're afraid of discovering that your life's primary project failed, that the thing you dedicated yourself to wasn't worth the dedication. And that fear keeps you pouring more years, more energy, more self into a failed project just to avoid admitting it failed. But the project has already failed. Staying doesn't change that. It just means you're failing longer. Why is this fear and not love? Because love is about now. About choosing to be together today because being together today is good. Fear is about protecting the story you've told yourself about your life. About maintaining the illusion that all those years meant something, even though they're making you miserable. Love looks at the present. Fear protects the past. And you can't live in the present while protecting the past. What is this costing you? It's costing you the rest of your life. Every year you stay to avoid admitting the previous years were wasted is another year wasted. You're not preserving the value of past years. You're adding more wasted years to wasted years. And it's costing you the possibility of creating meaning in the years you have left. You might have 20, 30 years left, and you could spend them actually living instead of protecting a story about years that are already gone. What does courage look like? Courage looks like being willing to say, yes, I wasted years. I gave them to someone who didn't deserve them, to something that wasn't good for me. And that was a mistake, a tragic mistake. But staying to avoid admitting the mistake doesn't fix the mistake. It compounds it. Courage looks like cutting your losses, like saying, the past is gone. I can't change it. But I can change what I do now. And I'm choosing not to waste any more years. Let me tell you about Kimberly. She's 59. She'd given everything to her marriage. Moved 6 times for his career. Gave up her own ambitions. Raised 3 children mostly alone while he traveled for work. For 35 years, she made his life possible. And the marriage was empty. No intimacy, no appreciation, no partnership. But Kimberly stayed because she thought, if I leave, what was it all for? I gave him my entire life. If it ends, I wasted my life. At 59, her daughter asked her, Mom, would you want me to stay in a marriage like yours? Kimberly said immediately, God, no, I'd tell you to leave. Then her daughter said, so why is it okay for you? And Kimberly couldn't answer. Because it wasn't okay. She was just afraid to admit that 35 years had been a waste. But her daughter said something that changed everything. Those years are already gone, Mom. You can't get them back whether you stay or leave. But you can stop wasting more years. So Kimberly left, and yes, she grieved. Grieved for the life she gave to someone who didn't value it. Grieved for the years she'd never get back. Grieved for the woman she could have been if she'd chosen differently. But after the grief came something unexpected. Relief. Freedom. and the chance to spend the years she had left actually living for herself. Kimberly told me, "I stayed because I was afraid my life had been wasted. But staying is what wasted it. Leaving is what saved the years I have left." That's the sixth sign. You're afraid leaving would prove your life was wasted. If that's you, you're staying out of fear. The seventh and final sign you're staying out of fear, not love, is that you've lost yourself so completely in the relationship that you don't know who you are without it. You've been his wife for so long that you've forgotten who you were before, what you liked, what you wanted, what made you happy. Your identity is completely fused with the relationship, and the thought of being separate, of being just you, not you as his wife, feels like ceasing to exist. So you stay, not because you love him, but because leaving would require discovering who you are. And that discovery feels terrifying. Because what if there's nothing there? What if you spent so long being his wife that you erased yourself completely? This is one of the saddest forms of fear, because it's about self-loss. You've disappeared into the relationship, and now you're afraid to leave because leaving would force you to confront your own absence. You'd have to rebuild an identity from nothing, have to rediscover preferences, interests, desires that have been dormant for decades. Have to answer the question, who am I? And that question feels too big, too scary, too existential. So you stay and continue to not exist, because not existing in a relationship feels safer than trying to exist outside of one. Walter Riso teaches that this fear is actually a form of emotional dependency. You're not dependent on him as a person. You're dependent on the relationship as a way to avoid yourself. The relationship gives you an identity, a role, a purpose. And without it, you'd be forced to create those things from within. And you're not sure you can. You're not sure there's a you strong enough to stand alone. So you stay. And the relationship continues to be the scaffolding holding up an empty building. Why is this fear and not love? Because love requires two whole people choosing each other. But you're not whole. You're half a person, maybe less. And you're staying because leaving would require becoming whole. And becoming whole requires work, pain, uncertainty. Love is about wanting to be with someone. Fear is about needing someone to exist through. And need based on self-loss is not love. It's desperation. What is this costing you? It's costing you yourself. Every year you stay because you don't know who you are without him is another year you don't discover who you are. You're not preserving yourself by staying. You're losing more of yourself. Because the longer you stay disappeared, the harder it becomes to remember who you were, to imagine who you could be. You're trading the possibility of selfhood for the comfort of not having to find it. What does courage look like? Courage looks like being willing to not know who you are, to leave anyway, to discover yourself through the process of being alone. Courage looks like trusting that there is a you underneath all the years of being his wife, and that you is worth finding, even if finding her is hard, even if it takes years. Courage looks like choosing the uncomfortable process of becoming yourself over the comfortable process of staying disappeared. Let me tell you about Deborah. She's 62. She'd been married for 40 years. And when people asked her about herself, she talked about him, his career, his interests, his needs. She had no hobbies of her own, no friends who were just hers, no interests he didn't share. She'd completely disappeared into being his wife, and the thought of leaving terrified her because she didn't know who she'd be without him. She'd literally forgotten. At 62, her husband died suddenly, and Deborah was devastated, not just by grief, but by terror, because now she was alone. And she had no idea who she was, what she liked, what to do with herself. She was completely lost. And for the first year, she was miserable. But slowly, something started happening. She started trying things, took a painting class, joined a book club, started traveling, and discovered pieces of herself she'd forgotten existed. She liked art, loved reading, enjoyed traveling alone. 2 years after her husband died, someone asked Deborah if she'd remarry, and she said no. Not because she didn't want companionship, but because she'd finally found herself, and she wasn't willing to disappear again. She'd spent 40 years being his wife. She wanted to spend whatever years she had left being herself. Deborah told me, "I stayed for 40 years because I didn't know who I was without him, and then he died and I had to find out anyway. And I discovered I was someone interesting, someone with her own thoughts and interests and desires. I just hadn't let her exist." That's the 7th sign. You don't know who you are without him. If that's you, you're staying out of fear. So here we are. You've heard the 7 signs that you're staying in a relationship out of fear, not love. You're more afraid of being alone than unhappy together. You stay because of how much time you've already invested. You're terrified of what people will think. You can't imagine starting over at your age. You're financially dependent and terrified. You're afraid leaving would prove your life was wasted, and you don't know who you are without him. These 7 signs, they're not just patterns, they're prisons built from fear, and every one of them keeps you trapped in a relationship that stopped serving you years ago, maybe decades ago. But here's what I need you to understand. Recognizing these signs is not the same as being told what to do. I'm not telling you to leave your relationship. That's your decision. Only you can make it. What I'm telling you is this. If you recognize yourself in these 7 signs, if you see your own patterns reflected back at you, then you need to be honest about what's actually keeping you there. You need to stop telling yourself it's love when it's fear. You need to stop convincing yourself you're staying for good reasons when you're staying for scared reasons. Because you can't make a real choice if you don't understand your real motivations. Walter Riso teaches that the most important relationship question you can ask yourself is this: if I had no fear, what would I do? Not what should I do? Not what would be practical? Not what would make everyone else comfortable? But if fear wasn't a factor, if you were completely free from the terror of being alone, of judgment, of financial instability, of wasted years, if all that fear disappeared, what would you choose? And the answer to that question is your truth. Everything else is just fear talking. And here's the hard part. Fear is a liar. Fear tells you that the catastrophe you're imagining will happen, that you'll be alone forever, that you'll be destitute, that everyone will judge you, that you wasted your life, that you'll cease to exist without this relationship. But fear is almost always wrong, because fear is not based on reality. Fear is based on imagination, on worst-case scenarios, on catastrophic thinking. And the catastrophe you're imagining is almost never the reality you'd actually experience. Think about the stories I told you. Patricia thought being alone would be unbearable, then discovered she was already alone, just with someone present. Lisa thought leaving after 35 years meant wasting those years, then realized staying was wasting more years. Carol thought everyone would judge her. They did, and she survived. Diane thought she was too old to start over. She wasn't. Sharon thought she'd be financially destroyed. She wasn't. Kimberly thought her life would have been meaningless if she left. It wasn't. Deborah thought she didn't exist without him. She did. Every one of them discovered that the fear was lying, that the catastrophe didn't happen, that they were okay, sometimes more than okay. But they only discovered that by being willing to face the fear and leave anyway. And that's what courage is. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is action despite fear. It's saying, I'm terrified and I'm doing it anyway. Because staying in something that's destroying me out of fear is not safety. It's slow death. And I'd rather face the terror of the unknown than continue dying in the known. Now some of you are thinking, but what if it's not all fear? What if there's love mixed in with the fear? And that's a fair question. Because relationships are complex, and it's possible to love someone and also be afraid to leave them. But here's how you know the difference. Love feels expansive. Love makes you more yourself, not less. Love feels like freedom, even within commitment. Love feels peaceful, even when it's hard. But fear feels constrictive. Fear makes you smaller. Fear feels like a cage. Fear feels like panic. So if you're in a relationship and you feel more trapped than free, more diminished than expanded, more panicked than peaceful, it's probably fear, not love, that's keeping you there. And here's the other truth. Even if there is love, love is not enough. You can love someone and still need to leave. You can love someone and recognize that the relationship is destroying you. You can love someone and choose yourself instead. Because love for someone else cannot come at the cost of love for yourself. And if staying in a relationship requires you to abandon yourself, to betray yourself, to diminish yourself, then it doesn't matter how much you love them. You still need to leave. Because the relationship you have with yourself is the most important relationship you'll ever have. And that relationship has to come first. Walter Riso says that women who successfully leave fear-based relationships all have one thing in common. They reach a point where they'd rather face their worst fear than live another day in the relationship. The fear of staying becomes bigger than the fear of leaving. And that's when change becomes possible. Because you can't leave from obligation, or because someone tells you to. You can only leave when staying becomes unbearable, when the cost of staying exceeds the cost of leaving. And only you know when you've reached that point. But here's what I can tell you. If you're watching this video, if you're recognizing yourself in these 7 signs, you're closer to that point than you think. Because people in happy relationships don't watch videos about whether they're staying out of fear. They don't need to. They're staying because they want to. But you're here. Which means some part of you knows something is wrong. Some part of you is questioning. Some part of you is considering the possibility that you're staying for the wrong reasons. And that part of you, that questioning part, that's the part that's waking up. That's the part that's getting ready to choose yourself. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to take out a piece of paper, and I want you to write 2 lists. On one side, write why you're staying. Be honest. Not what sounds good, what's actually true. I'm staying because I'm afraid of being alone. I'm staying because of money. I'm staying because I don't know who I am without him. Write the truth, all of it. On the other side, write what staying is costing you. Your peace, your self-respect, your authenticity, your joy, your life. Write all of that too. Then look at both lists. And ask yourself, is what I'm getting worth what I'm paying? Because that's what it comes down to. Is the financial security worth losing your peace? Is avoiding loneliness worth losing yourself? Is protecting the past worth sacrificing the future? Only you can answer those questions. But you need to answer them honestly, not with the answer you think you should give, with the answer that's actually true. And if you look at those lists and you realize that what you're paying is more than what you're getting, then you have a choice to make. You can stay anyway, but at least you'll be honest about why, or you can leave and face the fear and discover what's on the other side of it. And I can't tell you what you'll find there. Maybe loneliness, maybe struggle, maybe grief, but maybe also peace, freedom, yourself, and maybe the discovery that you're stronger than you thought, braver than you knew, more capable than you believed. Now, before you go, I need you to do something. Go to the comments right now. You don't have to say which sign is yours. You don't have to share your story if you're not ready. But tell me this. Are you staying out of love or staying out of fear? Just those words, love or fear. Because naming it is the first step to changing it. And I'll be there. I read every comment. And you're not alone in this. Thousands of women over 50 are asking themselves the same question, love or fear, and we're figuring it out together. And I need 2 more things from you. First, subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Enough and whole is your space for truth, the hard truths that set you free. We don't do comfortable lies that keep you trapped. We do uncomfortable truths that liberate you. Subscribe. Be part of this community. We need your voice here. Second, share this video carefully, thoughtfully, with a woman who might need to hear it. Your sister, your friend, your mother, someone who's staying out of fear but hasn't admitted it yet. Someone who needs permission to ask herself the hard questions. Send her this video. Because the more women who wake up, who see clearly, who choose themselves, the better the world becomes for all of us. And here's my final message to you. If you've recognized yourself in these 7 signs, if you know you're staying out of fear, I want you to hear this. You are not weak for being afraid. Fear is human. Fear is normal. But you don't have to let fear make your decisions. You don't have to let fear run your life. You can acknowledge the fear, feel the fear, and choose courage anyway. And courage doesn't mean you're not scared. Courage means you're scared, and you do it anyway. You leave anyway. You face the unknown anyway. You choose yourself anyway. Because staying in something that's destroying you to avoid fear is not safety. It's just a slower form of destruction. And you deserve better than slow destruction. You deserve peace, freedom, joy, authenticity, life, actual life, not just existence. Walter Riso teaches that the women who transform their lives in the second half are the women who are willing to face their deepest fears, who look at what terrifies them and walk toward it instead of away from it, who recognize that the fear of the unknown is often less destructive than the certainty of misery, and who choose the uncomfortable process of growth over the comfortable process of stagnation. You might be that woman. You might be ready. Or you might need more time, and that's okay too. Change happens when you're ready, not when you're told. But if you're here, watching this, recognizing yourself in these patterns, questioning whether you're staying for the right reasons, you're already changing. The questioning is the beginning. The recognition is the start. And from here, anything is possible. You are not trapped. You think you are, but you're not. You're just scared. And fear can be faced. Fear can be overcome. Fear can be walked through. And on the other side of fear is the life you're supposed to be living, the authentic life. The free life, the life where you're not performing or pretending or shrinking, the life where you're just you, fully, unapologetically, finally. So ask yourself the question, love or fear? What's really keeping you there? And be honest, brutally honest, because your life depends on that honesty. The rest of your life, the years you have left, they're waiting, and they could be beautiful, they could be peaceful, they could be yours, but not if you stay imprisoned by fear. Not if you keep trading your life for safety that isn't really safety at all. You deserve love, real love, not love mixed with fear, not love that requires you to disappear, not love that costs you yourself, but love that expands you, frees you, celebrates you. And if the relationship you're in doesn't do that, if it makes you smaller instead of bigger, then it's not the relationship you should be in. Even if you're scared, even if leaving feels impossible, even if you've been there forever, you still deserve better. You are enough. You are whole. And you don't have to stay in something that makes you feel like you're neither. You can leave. You can choose yourself. You can face the fear. And you can discover that you're braver than you ever knew. Welcome to the choice. Love or fear. Only you can answer. But whatever you answer, make sure it's the truth.